My name is Joel Garrison. I'm a hyper-curious learner and a lover of the sense of sight. I'm delighted to moderate this podcast dedicated to sight on behalf of the Internet of Senses Institute. Today, we are incredibly excited to speak with director, designer, producer, performer, puppeteer, artist, creator, researcher, and educator, Jonathan David Martin. Jonathan is a leader in using augmented and virtual reality in live theater. Of course, augmented and virtual reality are commonly called AR and VR. His plays use the web to combine socially relevant themes with an ambitious, multidisciplinary approach to storytelling. During his 15-year career, Jonathan's work has been featured on TV, in films, off-Broadway, on Broadway, at international film festivals, in the international tour, and in regional theaters nationwide. His list of projects is quite long, so I will tell you about his current roles and upcoming projects. He is the producing co-artistic director of Smoke and Mirrors Collaborative, a nonprofit production company. He is performing as a puppeteer in the Broadway production of Life of Pi. He served as creative producer and narrative designer for the forthcoming narrative VR experience, City of Sand. Somehow, Jonathan finds time to teach his craft, Immersive Media Design. He's a faculty member at the University of Maryland, where he is leading research into the narrative and user experience design possibilities of AR, VR, and training students from all parts of campus for future careers that will utilize spatial technologies. Jonathan has also taught at the California State University Northridge as part of their emerging media program. Plus, he's been a featured speaker at numerous academic institutions and academic and professional conferences throughout the country, including South by Southwest. I encourage everyone to check out Jonathan's full bio, which we will link to our distribution of this recording. Jonathan, thank you for giving me the honor of introducing you. I do have a master's degree in speech and theater, but I actually went into that degree because, unlike you, I have very little talent. I identified it as a weakness, something I wanted to improve. You would have done a much better job reading that intro, but thank you again for giving me that honor. Before we discuss the academic side of your work, can you tell us more about your current and upcoming endeavors?
Sure, I'd love to. And first, Joel, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's really just a pleasure to be here on the podcast today and have this conversation with you. So yeah, I think as our listeners gather, I like to wear lots of hats. I like to work in a lot of different disciplines. Yeah, so it keeps me very busy, but B, it's constantly an exploration about how to create really engaging experiences for audiences, and especially to do that around topics that are really relevant to society today. So one of the projects I'm currently working on is a research project with some collaborators at the University of Maryland. And it's right at the intersection of performance and technology. It's a piece called Dance Squared. And so essentially what it is a duet between a dancer and a robot. And the robot is very tiny. It's a very small robot called Calico. And Calico runs along a track, and the track is affixed to the dancer's costume, to clothing. And the track kind of looks like a monorail track that a monorail would run on. And the robot can be controlled through motion. It can be controlled through Bluetooth, other remote control devices. And so our team of computer science engineers, choreographers, user interface designers, we're really trying to kind of explore the relationship between smart technologies and individuals. And we're very influenced by square dancing. So in square dancing, you have a caller who calls out the next move in a piece of square dance choreography. So the dancers don't always know what's going to happen next. And we really love this idea because it sort of feels like the way that we interact with smart technologies today, where we should be able to tell it what to do and it's going to follow us at all times. but it doesn't always do that. And we sort of combined that idea with being inspired by Twitch Plays Pokemon. So for those listeners who aren't familiar with this was an online game of Pokemon, and viewers in Twitch could interact with the character and collectively control what the character in the game did. And we love this idea of being able to allow our audience to control the robot through a browser interface. So if you can imagine, in the middle of this dance, the audience is able to tell the robot to do something different that the dancer's not expecting, and to be able to see what the outcome of that is. And so what we end up with is this really interesting work of performance that explores a lot of our feelings around the future of artificial intelligence, around our interactions on social media, and how that starts to impact our bodies in a really physical way. Yeah, so that's one really exciting project I've got ongoing. As you mentioned, I'm the creative producer and narrative designer for City of Sand. This is a VR project that started as part of Oculus Launchpad, and we won a grant through that program to continue developing it. And so this will be a piece that's inspired actually by a true story. It's the story of Bay Ocean, Oregon, which was a resort town on the Oregon coast that was going to be the next Atlantic city about 120 years ago. And through some poor development choices, the entire town was washed away into the ocean. And so it became this really interesting cautionary tale for us to kind of take and run with in a fantasy sci-fi kind of way. And so we've created an aesthetic for it that we call sandpunk. So it's like if you took a beach resort and steampunk and you slam them together. And so a lot of the interactive mechanics and the storytelling, the animation, the world that we're creating in this VR experience is inspired by those. Also, of course, Life of Pi. So, if during the day I'm a mild-mannered college professor and creative director, at night I'm a tiger. And yeah, I'm a puppeteer in the show. And yeah, it's kind of this amazing combination of different skills that I get to put to use that are both physical, musical, in a really novel way through puppetry.
Jonathan, your work is so impressive. I am in awe of your ability to innovate and add to the visual art and entertainment experience. I know that there is a fantastic story here. So how did you become involved in immersive media design?
Yeah, I would say for me, I really started to work closely with technology and technologists around 2015 to 2016. I started working on a project called #Project with Smoke and Mirrors Collaborative, my production company. And at the time, we were really interested in exploring the topic of online extremism. And in particular, we wanted to ask the question of whether extremism could only happen to a certain subsection of people who are predisposed to extremist views or extremist thought, or whether we might all be influenced towards more extreme points of view, really depending on the information that we are given and what others around us are doing in a digital community, right? It's a phenomenon that we've seen over and over again via social media, especially as it takes more and more of our time and attention. And so we wanted to figure out if we could kind of take that phenomenon of interacting in a social media environment, but put it inside a theatrical context. And so working with a team of designers and technologists, we created an immersive installation. And so if you can imagine, the installation was kind of like a room of projection screens. Kind of like every wall is a projection screen with no roof on it. But on every surface, we're able to project digital information. And then the audience is able to collectively interact with the visual information they're seeing on the walls through motion sensors. And so the kind of storyline that we're roughing out is that they're on a social media platform and they can interact through games and answering questions with the information they're seeing on the screens in order to support a cause. And the cause is kind of a pro-social cause, but as they find out more information about what's going on, there starts to be some cracks in the narrative and in the story that they've been given. And the question we're kind of exploring is, how far along will people support a cause, even as they start to find information that maybe runs counter to what they thought they were supporting?
Yeah, I mean, just in what you've already shared with us, it's pretty obvious that storytelling is at the heart of everything that you do. I'm curious now, it seems like the story comes first and then you use the technology to help you tease out the story that you want to tell. How does that process work?
Yeah, so this is a process I work really closely with and with my students at the University of Maryland. And as you kind of were saying, I'm really starting with what's the use case? Like, why are we making this piece? I'm really interested in what the utility, if we're going to use a piece of technology, why is it really necessary to create an engaging, compelling, meaningful experience for an audience? So where I often start with my collaborators is to really articulate what we're exploring as a question. So you've kind of seen that with these pieces that I've given as examples. We're trying to sort of identify what's this question that we're trying to explore, because at the end of the day, we get to explore that with our audience. The question adds a direction, almost like momentum towards the piece, rather than sort of making a statement that the piece is round. By asking as a question, it leaves it open-ended. It leaves it for multiple interpretations. So that's a lot of times where we start, is with a question of inquiry. And then we build what that experience is around that core question. And especially when we're working with a very multidisciplinary team, we're working with new technologies, we're not quite sure exactly how it's going to work or how an audience is going to experience it. You can also often get lost in the details. And so you keep coming back to that core question to see if what you're proposing, no matter how cool it is, from a technology perspective, does it serve that central thing that you're after?
It's such a powerful form of exploration. I love the way that you approach storytelling, and it's obvious that you have a deep passion for storytelling. How did you develop your passion for storytelling?
Yeah, I think I was really fortunate to grow up with a family of storytellers. My grandfather is from a small town in Missouri, Ava, Missouri, and I was always hearing stories from his hometown. And there's these sort of really sometimes silly or poignant stories about different characters from his hometown. These sometimes are stories that have been passed down for 100 or 150 years or so. And so, that might be part of why I gravitate inherently towards story. I think in particular, I became really interested in visual storytelling through some early experiences I had with my dad. My dad's an architect, and he would take me to job sites when I was really, really young. And I was absolutely fascinated to watch the process of an environment take shape, to watch a house go up, a building go up, and to see what went into it, and to learn from him how he looked at space, and to look at how we interact with space and how space can tell a story through architecture and through design. And that got me just really, really interested in looking at those kinds of questions. And in some respects, theater is all about that, is about looking at human beings interacting with each other in space.
So that ties in with my next question. In theater, you practice your craft. In the classroom, you teach your craft. And obviously, part of your skill set is storytelling. So let's talk about the stories behind Jonathan, the practitioner. Let's dig a little deeper there. I'm fascinated by you as a practitioner because as much originality goes into your work. So I know that there's another excellent story here. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on your creative process? You told us how storytelling has become a powerful part of your life. How do you pick the stories that you now decide to tell?
I think often the stories that I look for are around topics that I don't have easy answers to. Online extremism, again, is a great example. It's something where it's easy to, I guess, condemn others' behavior when we don't feel like we share it or we understand it, and to write it off as something that maybe doesn't have to do with us, or we would never exhibit those kinds of behaviors. And I was curious about that. It's like, yes, is that true, or is it more complicated than that? So I think, I will say that I'm often looking for topics like that, where there's some gray area to be explored. I imagine that my audience often comes in with preconceived notions about the subject matter that we're going to explore in the piece, and I want them to leave with more questions than answers.
So, I mean, in addition to immersive, you could almost say interactive or exploratory. There's so much packed into this discipline that you're in. Do you see theater as your laboratory, like a laboratory for scientific experimentation to test what works and what doesn't work, to answer these tough questions that you're looking at with your storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, creating works of theater or other disciplines, and actually, especially when we're starting to work with immersive technology, it's definitely a laboratory. And that's a lot of how I think about it, how I approach it. It's a lot about testing out proposals, testing out ideas, seeing if they work. And part of that testing is a question, especially with immersive technology, of can we do something? Can we make something work? Can we figure out a system that uses motion sensors to follow collective action and then relay that into a result that an audience sees on an immersive screen, for example? But oftentimes, it's also a question, again, of should we create something? And what is the value of something that we can create with new technologies? And I love that experimental process, and to be surprised by it and see where it goes, to start off in a direction and then find that both as creators and hopefully then as the audience, we end up someplace we didn't expect and can draw connections with the world in ways that we're surprised by. For me, especially working with something like augmented reality, I think the possibilities there for creating experiences that help us to see the physical world in new ways, in ways that are really unique and surprising and create delight and magic, is some of the possibilities that I'm so excited to explore as a practitioner and also as an educator, and to see what my students do with that technology and what kind of stories they're interested in telling.
I'm just blown away, Jonathan. I mean, it's just really amazing. So this process that you're going through, you're learning so much about your discipline, but you're also learning a lot about life. So I'm interested in, like, what are some of the more significant insights that you've captured and their backstories?
Yeah, I think working with immersive technology, some of the insights that have really stuck with me are, especially when we're talking about Sight in particular, is about just how Sight really is the sense that creates context, that creates expectations and assumptions for an audience around environment, around character, around objects in the space. And at the end of the day, for most of us, it's the sense that we're the most aware of that gets our attention first. And so as content creators, whether it's in immersive theater or using immersive technology, we can really take advantage of that to kind of orient our audience. And it can also be something that creates delight by subverting those expectations. So I'll give you an example of this. There's a really wonderful narrative VR piece called Wolves in the Walls. And at the beginning of this VR experience, one of the first things that you see is a young girl who's standing a little bit below you, and she's looking up at you and says something along the lines of like, "Oh, hi there. Wait a minute. This isn't quite right." And she takes her hand and wipes it in front of your eyes, in front of your vision. And as she does, your vision sort of blurs out and then everything goes black. And then you hear the sound of chalk. And as you hear the sound of chalk, your vision starts to come back, and you now have a different point of view. You now see the little girl at eye level, and you understand a lot in that moment. You understand that you have a relationship with this little girl and that you're a creation of hers. She doesn't like how you came out at first, and so she smudges you out and then redraws you so that the height is correct. So you're at her eye level. And so this is a great little bit of visual storytelling that really helps to tell you quite a lot about what sort of story world you're in, tells you a lot about this principal character that you're going to interact with throughout the story. And it tells you a lot about who you are in this space and a bit about how you're going to interact with the story as it goes on. And when we're talking about immersive experiences, and especially ones where the audience is going to have a first-person experience, where they're going to interact directly, as opposed to being a voyeur, where they're sitting, if it's in a theater, they're sitting behind the proscenium arch, just away in the audience, passively watching, or if you're watching television in your living room. When they're inside of the story world, we need to often onboard them in this way to help them understand what the rules of the world are and what their place is in the world. And so I think those are kind of some key insights from working with immersive performance and immersive technology. And then I think one other area that has been really interesting to explore is around inattentional blindness. And intentional blindness is the phenomenon of when there is too much visual information coming into us for us to pay attention to all of it, right? Magicians take advantage of this phenomenon all the time. They create something interesting that's going on in their right hand, and that's what we look at, while their left hand may be doing something else in plain sight that they don't want us to see, and we don't notice it at all. And so again, this is an interesting phenomenon that we can take advantage of, so that we may want to change something about an environment or something else that's going on. We can sometimes make that change in plain sight of our audience, whether it's something that's virtual or something that's physical in the space. And if we create something else that's more interesting for them to put their attention on visually, they won't notice it. And the flip side is true too, right? Especially when we're creating work with a spatial digital content in VR and AR, it's really easy to put too much in somebody's field of view going on at the same time. And so it's easy to disorient our audience in a way that we don't intend, because they're not sure what to look at. There's too much moving around. There's too much to take in all at once. Usually for most people, if they're in a VR headset for the first time, that's just a novel experience that takes a lot of their attention. And so we have to be very aware as content creators about how we're leading our audience visually so that we don't overwhelm them.
So, I mean, that's an amazing perspective for the audience members. You describe your work as the intersection of immersive technology and live performance. What does this mean from a practitioner's perspective? Can you dive in? You've given us the audience perspective. What does it mean from the practitioner perspective?
Yeah, I think for anyone who's creating work at this intersection, what I've observed anyway, is that it's really the Wild West. And there's a ton of exciting experimentation going on, because we're not squarely in a traditional medium, whether that's video games, film, theater, even though we pull a lot from those other more traditional mediums that have ways of producing content, ways of working, vocabularies that have been well established. Working with immersive and emerging technologies, we're often figuring out not just what is interesting for an audience, but how we as a team go about making that. So the design process sometimes is different than what anyone on the team is used to working with. New technology sometimes means that the tools are not as streamlined as traditional editing tools, for example. And so as a practitioner, you start to learn that you need to build in a lot of extra time for creating work with immersive technology, knowing that you're going to have unexpected technical challenge or conceptual challenges that you didn't think that you were going to have when you set out to make the piece. And also along with that, then that means you're testing a lot. I think more so than certainly coming from a theater background, you do some testing in the sense of you'll do a reading of a new play, for example, or a small workshop. But I think especially when you're creating something with immersive technology, it really benefits to create something quickly, test it quickly, understand if it's worth the huge commitment of time resource and expertise resource, and sometimes monetary resource to build something. And before you really dive down a rabbit hole, you want to make sure that it's going to work the way that is going to serve the piece the best. And lastly, I think the thing that I've observed working at this intersection is that you get to work in a really multidisciplinary way, which is really exciting. So you're working with people not just from one industry, not just from film or theater or video games, but often people who are coming from a really broad cross-section of industries and backgrounds, because you really need those different, disparate, diverse skills and experiences to create something of value.
Yeah, so of course, this podcast is dedicated to the sense of sight, but in addition to being multidisciplinary, this medium is also multi-sensory. So I know immersive theater stimulates all five senses. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about how you as a practitioner use not just sight, but sound, touch, taste, and even smell. Before we dive deeper into the knowledge of the sense of sight.
Yeah, and I think what that points to actually is that oftentimes audiences will describe a moment in a work of performance that was really memorable, and they'll describe what they saw. But oftentimes what makes it memorable is that it was paired with very strong sound design and sometimes other senses as well. And that's a really important thing for, I think, for us that work in visual mediums to remember, is that often the secret sauce is in the sound, it's in these other senses. And one of the things I love about immersive performance, immersive theater, is that you can really engage the other senses like smell and taste and touch in ways that are hard to do with traditional mediums. And I think that on a basic level is because immersive performance can be really intimate. The audience is not at a distance from the event. They're not, again, separated by a screen. They're not separated in time, and they're not separated physically. And so we can interact with an audience, and the audience can interact with the world of the experience in ways that allow for touch, taste, and smell. I'll give an example actually of a VR experience that I did that I think executes this really, really well. So it was a piece called Cosmos Within Us by Tupac Matir that I experienced at the Venice International Film Festival when I was there with a project called Love Seat by Double I Studios. And in Cosmos Within Us, it's for one audience member. You're inside a VR headset, and what you're seeing is all pre-recorded visuals, but what you're hearing is a live narrative performance, and then there are live haptics happening around you. The scenario is that you're in the mind of an older man with dementia who's trying to hold on to his memories. And to give an example of one scene in particular that puts together a lot of different senses in a way that created so much magic and delight, he's remembering being a small boy, and he has a sibling that's just been born, and his parents aren't paying attention to him. And he's remembering the scene in a kitchen with his grandmother. And so visually, you're seeing kind of an animated version of grandmother, and she's telling you about, yeah, I know it's hard. No, it's really hard right now. Why don't you go ahead and just have a seat? And she points to a chair, and you visually see a chair. When I reached out my hands physically in space, there was a real physical chair there where the virtual chair would be. And so I can actually sit down in the physical chair that, again, matched where I could see the virtual chair. And then grandmother held out a tray of cookies that I could see in the VR space, this digital representation of cookies. And when I reached out my hand to try to grab one, there was actually a real tray and real cookies that I could touch. And then I could, of course, put that real cookie in my mouth and have that taste of cookies while I'm seeing them, while I'm hearing grandmother tell me that everything's going to be okay. And so, that's an example, I think, of how the combination of spatial digital storytelling and physical storytelling, using a lot of elements of live performance, can be incredibly powerful for an audience.
Wow, Jonathan, preparing for today, I explored the body of your work in detail. It's extraordinary, and the answers that you have provided just absolutely brilliant. As billed, I think our audience will be able to see your work is definitely on the cutting edge of immersive media design. The University of Maryland is very fortunate to have you on faculty. So now I want to geek out and shift focus a little bit. And instead of talking about Jonathan, the practitioner, I want to talk about you as an academic. Please give us a quick synopsis of the courses that you teach.
This isn't actually a course, but it's what I'm working on right now at the University of Maryland. It's something called the New Works Incubator. And so this is a program that I helped launch a couple of years ago in immersive media design as a summer intensive And it allows students from across the University of Maryland, no matter if they're undergrad, graduate, PhD students, to propose works of immersive media design that they're excited to build, and they can be accepted into the program, and we'll support them to build those experiences for a live audience. And, this was a program that was really important for me to start, because I remember being a student and often wondering why spaces, equipment, resources over the summer weren't really available for students and weren't being used in ways that could really foster creativity and, in part, actually some entrepreneurship. Because for these students, often it's a different thing when you're told in a class you have to do something and you have that class academic structure, versus when you're given the space and time, like in an incubator, to propose something that you're passionate about, that you're excited by, and then the work of us as mentors, as staff, is really there to support them, to create some accountability, create a deadline, but then to also offer space, equipment, and mentorship. And so the New Works Incubator is in its third year. We've got a cohort of around 20 students with over a dozen projects that range from virtual reality, augmented reality, interactive projection design. And at the end of July, they'll have built working demos of these projects. And the projects that are then completed will be presented in September as part of a campus-wide arts festival called Next Now, that's put on by the Clarice Smith Center for the Performing Arts. And so we partner with the Clarice Center to showcase these student works at the Center for the Performing Arts, which is on one side of the campus, and then also in our lab in Immersive Media Design that is on the other side of the campus. And it's created a lot of really excellent impact around campus to expose students and the wider community to these works of immersive media. And it also gives it a really invaluable experience to the students to be able to build their own pieces, see how an audience engages with them, and then grab those takeaways from having tested them with an audience. A lot of times when they first test with an audience, they have these huge aha moments about their works that they didn't know while they were working on it alone in a lab. And watching that whole process for me as an academic, as an instructor, is really rewarding, and to see how these students will then take their projects and continue to refine them and build them out. That same ethos actually goes into the class that I teach. So I teach a studio class at the University of Maryland's Immersive Media Design program. For 2 years, it was specifically around augmented reality design. It was a senior level elective course that was actually open to students from across campus. Immersive Media Design is a relatively new program at University of Maryland, and we recognized there were a lot of students that wanted to work with immersive media, but were already engaged in various other majors around campus. And so this course kind of starts from square one, asking what is augmented reality on a technical level, conceptual level? What are the tools that we use to add augmented reality to an experience? And over the course of the semester, the students will learn how to propose concepts, to design those concepts, to create proof of concepts and prototypes, to do some initial testing, build them out inside of a game engine, principally Unity as kind of the primary software that we'll use with the students. And then at the end of the semester, they'll create group projects that are all the way at demo stage. And then they'll present those in kind of a modified pitch to faculty and also to guest industry professionals who I'll bring in over the course of the semester to talk to the students about their work and about getting into various jobs and workplaces that utilize immersive media. And so the goal with the course is, on the one hand, really kind of using augmented reality to teach these fundamental skills of collaborative working, of experimentation and production, combining those with the technical skills to build augmented reality, and then connecting those learning principles with how those play out a bit in the real world, connecting them to how they can take the skills that they're learning and see how they would use those in a workplace setting.
So, I mean, just like in your practice, you're bringing the intersection of immersive technology and live performance there to your students, and they're learning by not just the philosophical inquiry, but also practice of doing. I love it that you talked about the term augmented reality and how you break that down. You kind of alluded to you're not only integrating the augmented reality into the classroom, but you actually have a discussion about what it is and kind of a philosophical understanding, looking at the technology as, what it is and how it can be used. And it just seems like maybe before you actually touch the technology, you have these really, amazing conversations with your students.
Yeah, I think so. I think in teaching students how to work with augmented reality, I'm constantly trying to balance teaching them conceptual skills and ways of thinking about how to use the technology from an experiential point of view, and pairing that with the technical execution of working with those technologies. And it's always an interesting balance to try to fit, especially when I've got a really diverse set of students who are coming sometimes from art backgrounds or from computer science backgrounds, or from other parts of campus where they're focusing on psychology or social work or architecture. And so finding a way to take that whole cohort of students along definitely means that, I want them to be thinking really holistically about the technology, understanding certainly about, from a technical side, at least on a very basic level, like why it works and how it uses your phone's camera if you're deploying it through a smartphone, because that can be important for the actual execution of building something, and understanding why something doesn't work when you're testing it, and for evaluating different ways maybe of going about taking an idea of your head and actually executing it. Yeah, but we're also certainly talking about what it means to take in digital content inside of the context of the real world, because I think often we don't think hard enough about, again, why are we making this? Why are we wanting to create an experience that uses this technology that cannot be created in any other way? How is it unique? How are we really using the affordances of augmented reality, what it does that nothing else does, to create something really novel? And once the students really tune into that, they start to become part of this growing body of creators that really speak the language of augmented reality, right? We're constantly trying to figure out what is this new language in this new medium. And so we start to kind of create a shared vocabulary around what we're saying, using terms that could be really specific to augmented reality. An example of some of the vocabulary that we'll start to talk about that's really specific to augmented reality can be something like occlusion. And so this is the phenomenon of when one object is obstructed visually by another object. And this is a phenomenon that we take advantage of on stage all the time, right? So we might see on stage that we're watching a character, they walk behind something, and then, when they pop out the other side, something is radically different. Suddenly they've changed costumes, or it's a different person. Something unexpected has happened in that moment of occlusion. And so there's magic that can happen when we lose sight of something and then it pops back into view again. And the same thing can happen with using something like augmented reality. Sometimes it's just as simple as watching a digital ball seemingly interact realistically with our space, watching a ball roll underneath our couch and disappear, right? This simple phenomenon can create a whole lot of delight. And so that becomes a little bit of like something we can point to as part of our vocabulary, something we might want to take advantage of. And so there's kind of a whole, sort of list of those working vocabularies that we develop over the course of the semester.
Yeah, I mean, and part of that vocabulary, the term immersive has to be, one of the core words, descriptors that you explore. I'm sure there's a number of academic definitions. I actually looked up several of them, and they're all somewhat similar, but I'm interested in what the term means to you. So how do you define immersive?
For me, on a basic level, it means that there's no distance between what you're focused on as the user or audience member of an experience and point of your attention, right? So in some respects, it's almost easier to say, again, what it's not. So again, to point to that example of watching TV from your couch, sitting inside of a proscenium theater and watching a piece of theater that's happening safely behind the fourth wall and you at a distance. And when we're immersed in something, yeah, we're inside of it, essentially. We can think about the sort of the theatrical space as almost having substance to it, like water. And we're immersed in that story world. We're immersed in the environment of it. We are able to often interact with the characters that exist inside of that story world, the objects that exist inside of that story world. And so I think for me, that's really what immersive boils down to.
That's really powerful. Even going to the movie theater, you go in, you watch a great movie, and time flies by, and if it's really good, all of your worries in life and everything are kind of set aside, and you're just in the moment. I can only imagine how your discipline can really take people away from their reality into something really magical. It's really amazing what you're doing. So I want to shift just a little bit. One of the things that has been a part of theater magic for a long time is the use of light, and light's been used for hundreds of years in theater to cast a mood and help the audience relate and be immersed into the story. How do you teach light? Is it different in AR and VR? Do you incorporate a lot of the same techniques from the traditional theater? Maybe define that, because I think that's part of the sense of sight and how we relate to what we're seeing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Light at the end of the day is a fundamental ingredient to a sighted experience. Yeah. And I think your hunch that there's some similarities between how light is used in a theatrical content and how it's used in a virtual and augmented context is right on. And for me as an instructor, I'm often drawing those parallels between the ways that we'll use theatrical lighting, especially in an immersive performance situation, for how we might want to think about using it with augmented and virtual reality. And the primary thing that light does is that it tells us what to look at, tells us where to put our attention. And so it's a very powerful tool in that way. And it's both on a technical level and a design level, the way that we can create really strong opening moments, that onboarding that I was talking about, teaching the audience about how they're going to take in the world. Light's going to be the primary tool that we do that in terms of telling them where to look, thus where to put their attention. And beyond orienting them where to look. And by the way, to say why that's incredibly important is because, unlike a 2D medium where your audience is always looking at the box, the frame that's there, where the screen is or where the stage is, they're free to look in 360 degrees because there may be something interesting anywhere around them. And so we have to take into account that they've got that agency to look, to put their attention anywhere around them that might seem interesting. And so light really can help us to point to where things are interesting. And in combination with light is the quality of light. And the quality of light can tell us a whole lot about what kind of environment that we're in. What is the mood or the tone of the piece? What time of day is it where we are? So we start to learn the rules of the world through the quality of light that's being used, the color of light, and then also, of course, how light moves. So the movement of light from one place to the next, again, is fundamental if we want the audience to be looking behind them and then to look in front, to look up, to look down, especially because for most of us, we're used to just looking in one direction to take in content. There's a little bit of unlearning that we often have to do with our audience to tell them, hey, there's more than just what's right in front of you to start with. There's maybe other things that we want you to explore in this immersive story world that we're going to use light to orient you with. I would say, the other two things that I'll point out to my students about how light works with immersive technology is about being able to highlight the spatial relationships between objects in space, especially because our perception of objects in a virtual space may be a bit different than when they're in a physical space. How we're kind of crafting light between objects becomes very important. And because we can't actually touch digital objects unless we've created a physical one that exactly matches it, as they did with Cosmos Within Us, we can infer the feeling of something through the way that light interacts with a digital texture or surface, right? So if it looks rough, if it looks smooth, if it looks velvety, we can almost feel like we can touch something because of the way that light interacts with a digital object.
So while you're working, you have to think about this as you're developing the medium, trying to focus the viewer at the point that the action that is telling the story is at. Is there any space, like in traditional theater, where you use visual illusions or any type of trickery? Is there room for any of that in this medium, or would that be something that you wouldn't want to risk losing your viewer to?
Oh, I think it's absolutely something to take advantage of. Yeah, I think both as a practitioner of stagecraft and also, creator of digital content, I maybe it's just that for me as an audience, I'm a total sucker for things that create magic, delight, that are unexpected. And so I'm constantly looking for those opportunities to create sleight of hand, to create magic. I think, as I look at what is unique about augmented virtual reality, it is that opportunity to create something that's really magical, to try to hone in on sometimes about how a moment of magic works differently when we're talking about digital content versus physical content. Maybe an example of this would be, again, to kind of take the magician as an example. When a magician pulls a quarter from behind your ear, there's kind of a moment of magic because they've pulled this physical thing that wasn't there behind your ear, but it seems that they have just pulled it from there. And that seems quite magical. If we're in a situation where a digital character pulls a digital coin from behind your ear, that doesn't seem quite as magical. We sort of understand that digital content can kind of come from anywhere and go from anywhere. And so it doesn't quite seem so unique. But if we have a situation where a physical performer reaches behind your ear and maybe they pull a digital coin from behind your ear that they hold in their hand, and then they're able to seemingly with their finger stretch that out and to make it massive in scale, and do something else with that content, then that may cause delight. It might be that interaction, that surprising interaction between a physical character performer and a digital object can make our brains go, whoa, how is that happening? In the same way that traditional sleight of hand or magic on stage might do.
Yeah, and of course, these type of techniques because these are things that you're learning in your lab, that these are part of your experiment. So you know what has worked and what hasn't worked.
I'll just jump on that to
Yeah.
actually say really quick, actually, on that point of knowing what works and what doesn't work. I think actually what's really exciting is that often I don't know. And I feel like I still don't know. I feel like what's so exciting for me both as a practitioner, as an academic, what's exciting then with my students is that it's so much of this feels like it's so new that we're really kind of just at the tip of the iceberg. And the rate that this technology, both the hardware and the software, progresses, and what other practitioners and academics are finding, means that we're constantly understanding more, changing the way that we talk about it, changing our understanding of it. And I think as a side note, that means that for me as an educator, I'm trying to come at it for my students from the perspective of we're all in the lab together. I'm not the one who has all the answers, that knows everything, and I'm going to relay that to you. And I'm going to pull from this hundreds of years of history that is, what I'm able to draw from. We're, again, all of us in this kind of Wild West state of experimentation. And so I'm excited along with the students to see what we discover, to see what works. And I treat even the way that I'm teaching and the concepts that I'm bringing in as hypotheses that we're all testing together. And some of those things will work and some of them won't. And it's as important to celebrate the beautiful failures that don't work the way that we expect, the phenomenon that doesn't act the way that we thought it would, the things that don't translate from immersive theater, for example, into working in virtual reality or augmented reality for whatever reason, and to really celebrate that. That failure is kind of one of these, it's our huge friend in this arena.
Jonathan, I could ask you 1,000 more questions. Like you mentioned, we're just scratching the surface of this new discipline. And I'm sure every time you go into the lab setting, it's a thrilling experience. So you're very fortunate and very lucky, and your students are very fortunate and very lucky to be able to share those moments with you. My last question that I wanted to ask is, are there any other fascinating concepts associated with the sense of sight that you teach that maybe we haven't explored yet?
I think we've touched on a whole lot of them, and there's constantly more that we can talk about. A lot of times, again, I'm really drawing from the ways that we talk about immersive performance. So things like really understanding the power of spatial relationships and proximity to things. When two people stand close together, that means something different than when they stand really far apart. When we as an audience is really close to something of interest, whether that's an object or an event that's happening, that we want to be conscious as creators about how we're taking advantage of those spatial relationships because we're in 3D space. And that's different than if we're looking at something in a 2D setting. One of the secret powers of augmented virtual reality is playing with scale. We can create really amazing, unique experiences just by playing around with our relationship to scale. It's why there's been several really successful adaptations of Alice in Wonderland in a VR, AR context, because of the delight that can happen, or a new perspective on the world that can happen through playing with scale. And I think one other area that I find is really important for exploring augmented reality is this question of opacity versus transparency. So again, thinking about these other principles about wanting to make sure that we don't overload our user with too much visual information, but we want to make sure that they are able to interact with the content in a way that feels very natural. We're often thinking about, how the user interface should work. Should the user interface be something that's anchored in the world itself, so spatially at a distance from the user? And so that's going to be something that's more has a lot of opacity so that it feels very solid. So if they're using something, if they're interacting it with a touch, for example, that feels really intuitive. Or is it the kind of user interface that wants to exist in a more traditional way, kind of in a 2D way on the screen of their phone? In which case, we want to make sure that doesn't occlude what they're seeing through the camera. So is there transparency that we're wanting to create there, or, putting that into some part of the space of the screen? I think what all of these different tips, techniques, approaches, considerations point to, again, is how much they touch on so many different disciplines, right? In this conversation, we've talked about, things having to do with user experience, engineering questions that are really about embodied experience, and almost getting into a dance context. And certainly we've talked a lot about theater. And so, at the end of the day, more than any of the sort of technical concepts that I want my students to leave with, I really want them to leave with a heightened sense of curiosity about what can be created, about new ways that we can tell stories, and new ways that we can illuminate the world around us by taking art, by taking story, by taking spatial technologies, and finding novel ways of putting them together.
Wow, Jonathan, just absolutely wow. You and your work are a gift to everyone that comes into your space. Very blessed to have this opportunity to interview you today, and we can't thank you enough for being part of this. Anyone that listens to this, I'm sure, is going to be really amazed at how much they're able to collect and learn from it. So thank you, Jonathan. Everyone, Jonathan D. Martin, please go check out his bio and check out some of his work and keep up with what Jonathan's doing. Truly gifted, talented, and as we read at the beginning, so many different roles and talents that he is offering us. So thank you, Jonathan. Do you have anything that you'd like to say before we shut it down?
No, just again to, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the conversation. It's been a pleasure.